morning, everyone. It's 7:30 on Saturday morning. We are going to get started on our session. So I am Katie Posch, and along with my co-chair, Zach Messer, I just want to welcome you all to the hot topics in clinical research. And we're going to be talking kind of about all things remote today. So from the beginning of a study where you're dealing with regulatory startup all the way through the end where we're trying to figure out the data cleaning and how to resolve queries and really everything in between. So we have a lineup of 6 really great speakers who are going to cover that for us. My really cool introductory slides are somewhere buried in the system, so I'm just winging this right now. But really, remote research isn't new. It's been around for years, even before COVID happened. But really, we're looking to go forward with what can we do, because with remote research, we can really expand who we are doing our research on, and we can get a lot more people. So like they talked about in the plenary yesterday, when those trials, when you need 1,000 people in a trial to make the statisticians happy, with remote research, we can kind of do that. And so we're going to get started, and thank you. And we're going to use the app for questions, but, it's early. If you really have something pressing or you're having technical difficulties, which is really relevant in remote research, feel free to stand up, raise your hand. We'll figure it out as we go along. So first up is Marisa Lynn. Hopefully this one, yes. So, and she's going to be talking about kind of the regulatory side of research and how to get all these remote research projects up and going.
Good morning. Bigger crowd than I expected on the last day. So the title of my talk is The Era of Almost Everything. Electronic has arrived. And I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm a regulatory coordinator. So today I'm going to be talking about electronic regulatory systems and the guidance and regulations that we need to follow, and our experience at University of Michigan and the advantages and challenges. And then I'll move on to electronic consent and also the guidance and regulations and obtaining consent in the age of COVID. So for those that are not familiar, electronic regulatory systems are used to maintain regulatory documents for studies in electronic form. So they typically have a central binder that contains anything not study specific, like study team credentials, lab certifications, IRB rosters, SOPs, temperature logs, handwriting samples, and so on. And then the study binders themselves will pull the appropriate documents in from the central binder and contain all study-specific documents. They allow you to create various logs for delegation, monitoring, and training. And there are several of them that exist, and they all have little differences between them. So if you're not familiar, I pulled up some examples from Complion, which is the system we've been using the last couple of years. And on the left is the binder setup screen. So I pulled our Begin study up, and you can designate your storage areas so that it pulls in your temperature logs and that kind of thing. And then your staff, whatever lab you're using, so that'll pull in your lab documents. And then central labs, the equipment that you're using, so if you have special documentation for that, and any appropriate SOPs and your IRBs. And then on the right, I am showing the delegation log. So I had it all set up with our staff and their roles, and then I chose one so that you can see that it'll give you a drop down of all of the tasks that we assigned. And it ultimately gets routed to your PI to sign off on beginning and end, kind of the typical situation. So the regulations for electronic regulations are not very specific, or but you are still expected to comply with the regular regulations that we follow, including GCP guidelines, 21 CFR Part 11, and IND and IDE regulations. And a little bit more detail on the 21 CFR Part 11, the electronic signatures require that electronic records, signatures, and handwritten signatures executed to electronic records must be trustworthy, reliable, and generally equivalent to paper records and handwritten signatures executed on paper. So, among other things, they're going to include an audit trail, security controls with individual access and password expiration, specific access levels that are assigned, version tracking, and the final documents are going to be read-only. And they always have to have a disaster recovery plan. So then the benefits include that you can get remote signatures from the whole team without having to track everybody down, which alone makes it totally worthwhile. You can access it from anywhere, which was wonderful with COVID especially, but just in general, when you're like me, I do a lot of work from home, and I don't have to be like, oh, when I go into the office, I need to take care of this, because it's all right in front of me. You've got that 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. You can give your monitors remote access so they can check all of those study documents, and it's a lot less that they have to go through in person. And then there are often multiple formats for delegation and that sort of thing, where you can have a central one where it's just assigned for your staff, or you can do it study specific. And so far we've just done study specific. And there's only one central binder to maintain. You don't have to have a million copies of everybody's fresh CV and all of those documents, and it's so much easier to not have to set up a new binder with everything. And you can slowly start reclaiming a little bit of space. Not all of it, but a little. So then we found some challenges. I think the first one that was most obvious to me was the division of labor. And with as many studies as we have going, we will get documents every day coming in that need to be filed. And at first I was kind of like, how are we going to do this? Am I doing all of this, or am I going to expect our coordinators to figure out that they need to file stuff? And ultimately, I try to make a point of getting everything in. So I'll let my emails kind of accumulate unread for a couple days that I know I'm going to need to file. And then when I have some time, I'll go and pull everything down and move it in. So then also there's some cases where there's a lack of template flexibility. We've had sponsors that kind of weren't sure about it, and we had to go into a lot more detail and get some additional assurance, and then others haven't blinked at all. And then we have also had to navigate the sponsor preferences for some of the documentation. I've been sending the protocols and the IBs to everybody on the study team to look over, and they sign off on it as they complete that. And then, the sponsors all still have their training logs and all of that, and so we've been figuring out kind of on a case-by-case basis of how we need to do it. So then we have to obviously have buy-in from our monitors, and we also needed buy-in from our less central staff like pharmacy, and that took a little effort to get our pharmacist on board with having to take on another system, and but now she's doing it, and it's been working just fine. So in the beginning, we adopted the Complion e-regulatory platform in 2019 without support from our institution. It required extensive discussion with IT and clinical trials operations, compliance, and the whole works. And we were made aware at some point in there that there was a plan for some future enterprise deployment of the Forte Advara e-reg system, but they couldn't give us a timeline, and we just wanted to get moving. So we were able to use the TDN grant funding for our initiation fee with Complion. It took close to a year to get everything up and rolling and jump through all of the hoops. And then once we got it, we were kind of had this whole thing that we had to figure out. And so we didn't like jump in and transfer everything onto it immediately. But then kind of COVID forced us to really get into it. So we found that we really wished we could email our documents to the study binders instead of having to upload everything individually. New features have become available since we started, including the log features, and those have been helpful. They're a small, agile company, and they're willing to create new templates for you or do other customizations, and that was really helpful. And today, we now have enterprise access to the Forte Advara eReg, and we're slowly making the change. I think I've got 2 studies in startup that are in there. I haven't transferred any other studies in yet. So benefits include no additional fees to our team, which is wonderful. There's less administrative burden. The IRB rosters and lab certificates are uploaded by somebody else, and so those will just automatically flow in. We can email documents directly to the binder for filing later. But the drawbacks are it's a whole new system to learn when we're all comfortable using Complion. And we have to meet certain milestones at our institution in order to begin using eReg for a study. And so sometimes I'll have a sponsor chomping at the bit to get their initial signed documents, the 1572 and everything, and I'll be like, I don't have access to the thing. I need, some other group to get caught up so that we can do that. And so that's kind of our experience with the eReg system. And now I'm going to move on to electronic informed consent. So electronic informed consent needs to conform to many regulations depending on the sponsor and the type of study, including FDA 21 CFR Part 11, e-records and signatures, and then Parts 50 and 56 for IRB review, along with the HHS 45 CFR Part 46 requirements for IRB review. So some extra things to think about. The electronic informed consent must contain all elements of informed consent required by regulations governing the study. Electronic signatures need to comply with 21 CFR Part 11, which may require additional verification from subjects or the LAR, such as a security question or passcode. There are many different methods that can be used for electronic informed consent, including DocuSign, SignNow, Adobe Sign, RedCap, and Qualtrics. And sometimes you have to get creative if you are needing to do pediatric assent. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit more. If you can, within the regulations, the easiest option is to seek a waiver of assent. You could also obtain the electronic informed consent from the LAR and then obtain the assent in person if you're going to have an in-person visit. And then you have to deal with how you're going to send the assent and finding a way of verifying that it's actually the child. And so I suggest including the child in the consent discussion. Of course, you may have to get a little bit more specific and on their level for the assent part. The benefits of an electronic informed consent are that you can incorporate other media that would help enhance understanding, like hyperlinks or videos. The regulations allow flexibility to use either method over the course of a study. So you might do an electronic informed consent at the beginning, and then if an amendment comes along and you need to reconsent, you can do it on paper if you want. It allows plenty of time for the patients or the LAR to review. And studies requiring the signature of 2 parents can really be easier if you are able to get them beforehand and have both, and then they don't have to be trying to coordinate schedules to all be present for the visit. So then challenges, the systems may not work for people who have difficulty with technology, lack access, or have poor motor skills. The IRB may require additional documentation if they're not familiar with the platform you're using. I ran into that with Advara at the very beginning of COVID when they weren't set up for people obtaining electronic informed consent, and I had to send them a whole bunch of extra information, and they approved it, but it was more stuff to deal with. And if you're not on the Zoom with the subject or the LAR while they're signing, you need some identity verification. And even for our team, we found that the software could be confusing because we weren't using it on a daily basis. And I still get questions from our team when they run into problems, and it's all an unfamiliarity thing for the most part. So our experience with electronic informed consent occurred because of COVID. So our institution got us access to Sign Now in spring of 2020, and we kind of jumped right in with that. We still sometimes use it for our registry consent because our social workers are the ones that obtain consent, and they are mostly doing virtual visits. And so we specifically ran into a problem when we needed potential subjects to obtain a COVID test prior to a screening visit where we were going to get full consent. So we made a brief electronic consent that would just cover that, and then it caused a whole bunch of confusion with the sponsors and the IRB, and then ultimately they decided we didn't need it. So, in summary, COVID drove our adoption of these systems. As we have returned to semi-normalcy, we have the luxury of keeping what works best and setting aside other options for use when they would be most beneficial. And that brings it to a close. I managed to snap a quick picture of the crowd. So here we are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, no, don't leave. There's questions. Stay.
I thought we were doing them at the end.
Oh, no. We're doing them at the end of your presentation.
Okay.
So thank you very much. If anybody has questions, use the app, or you can stand up, raise your hand. But my question kind of for you was, how did you overcome the difference, the people who lacked the buy-in? So you had mentioned your pharmacy wasn't totally on board with it. What did it take to overcome those who weren't interested?
We had initially I set up an account for the pharmacist, and stuff got ignored, and we would have to get a wet signature then. And I think ultimately Dawn talked to her and was like, we need this, it'll make life easier, and she agreed to, and now I just put her on all of our studies, and she's taking care of it, so.
Okay, that was my question. Anybody else, any hands? Let's see.
Thank you. Thanks. Lauren, I think you're next. Okay, there.
So next up is Lauren.
Go ahead, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I'm a senior research coordinator based at the University of Washington in Seattle.
The first one, and then you can use
Okay. No disclosures related to this presentation. And today I'm going to be talking with you all about how to leverage the rules of engagement, as I like to call them, in multi-site recruitment strategies, and how we kind of apply this to a study that I've been working on.
So to give you some background, for the past few years, I've been working with my team to create Take on Transplant. It is a web-based educational resource about lung transplant. It contains up-to-date guidelines based and CF-specific information about lung transplant in the form of CF stories. We have a resource library and FAQs. And so we have been working on developing this resource in kind of an iterative process through lots of testing with and development with patients and caregivers. And so we started we call it the Lung Transplant Ready Pilot RCT, which is kind of our first full testing of this website. And so the purpose of the study was to assess feasibility of an RCT to determine whether this educational website could improve preparedness for discussions about lung transplant with CF providers and loved ones. It was a 4-week study, all done through Zoom. There were a total of 3 visits that ended up being about 30 minutes to an hour long. And during those interviews, or during those Zoom sessions, we would have qualitative interviews. We would do surveys. I always tell patients, what is research without surveys? And then we also captured website analytics throughout the study. And then for recruitment goals, what we wanted to enroll a total of 50 participants, and we were including people who had an FEV1 of 50% of predicted or lower, and no prior lung transplant. And then kind of our focus for this website has been this community of concern. So with these characteristics, we were really focused on finding these participants in our study, so people who had Medicaid insurance, non-white race, Hispanic ethnicity, and a high school education or less. We have found in our prior research that these people are far more disadvantaged when it comes to lung transplant and are more often or more likely to die prior to getting lung transplant. And so we wanted to include at least 25 people or 50% in our study. So first thing I did to see how many people were eligible at the University of Washington is I screened Port CF. And we found that we had a total of 36 eligible participants, and 17 of those were in that community of concern. And so that was not 50. And so we were thinking of different options of what we can do to try and find these participants elsewhere. And so this brings me to we were thinking about external recruitment. There are a few different options you can go to work with these outside collaborators. And so typically we have option number 1 here, which involves working with other sites in kind of more involved way. So you would require IRB approval for anything from screening, recruiting, or consenting, enrolling. And then if there's any sort of transfer of data between sites, you also need a data use agreement. As we all know, this process can be very time-consuming and very expensive, also kind of depending on how many sites you're working with. And then there's option 2. You can also recruit using community voice, social media potentially. But again, this kind of casts a very wide net, and so you're limited in screening, potentially missing your target audience and who you want to enroll. And so we looked at these options, and these weren't great for kind of what we were trying to do. And so we started thinking about other alternatives, ways we could get creative with recruiting, which brings me to these rules of engagement, as I like to call them. It's a set of guidance documents published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Human Research Protections, and this guidance document is titled Engagement of Institutions in Human Subjects Research. And basically this document describes various instances of institutional involvement in non-exempt human subjects research where IRB approval may or may not be required. And so starting off with when IRB approval is required, it says that if an institution is the primary awardee of federal funding, or if its employees or agents conduct one of the following activities for the research. So if they obtain participants' data or biospecimens through intervention or interaction, if they obtain, use, study, analyze, or generate participants' identifiable data or identifiable biospecimens, or if they obtain consent, then it is all considered to be engaged in the research, and IRB approval is required for those sites that are doing these activities. There are a number of other things that are listed in this document that are instances when IRB approval is not required, and one of them is listed here. So if institutional involvement and if employees or agents' activities are limited to the following. So if they are informing prospective participants about the availability of research, if they're providing prospective participants with information about the research but do not obtain informed consent or act as representatives of the investigator, if they provide prospective subjects with information about contacting investigators for information or enrollment, and or if they seek to obtain permission for investigators to contact them. In all these instances, it is considered sites are considered to be not engaged in the research, and so if sites are doing only these activities, then IRB approval is not required. And so this was kind of the key for us. So if we limited sites' activities to only advertising the study for us, they would not require that IRB approval. And so that was kind of one of the important factors that we did implement kind of in our strategy. And then we started also thinking about the data aspect. So if participants were advertising this study to their participants, how are they going to tell us who was interested in helping us with this research or not? We could hand out flyers to participants and put all the responsibility on them to contact us, but that typically doesn't work well. We want to be the active ones contacting participants. And so a data use agreement is a legally binding document anytime that information is transferred from one site to another. So anytime here it's listed when that data use agreement is needed, typically when it involves human personal information. However, when there are instances when a DUA is not required, for example, when that information is completely de-identified, so when there's no personal data, no HIP identifiers, then a data use agreement is not required. But we thought that if that data was coming directly from participants straight to us, there would not be any sort of transfer from institution to institution. It was all self-reported, and they consented. Data use agreement would not be required. So this kind of brings us to our solution, so bringing all of those kind of together. So we kind of set it up so the University of Washington, we would be the primary people doing the research. So we would be the ones getting IRB approval. So for our pilot RCT, we would be doing all the consenting, all the study procedures, all of the data analysis. And then in our recruitment strategy, we would set up this screening survey. So we would have this screening survey that would be distributed to other collaborating sites where they could advertise the survey for us to their participants. And so we would create talking points, we would create email language and informational handout for in-clinic for these external sites. And then because these collaborating sites were only advertising these materials for us in the study, they would be not engaged, and IRB approval was not required. And so our survey, what we did, it was a survey that contained kind of information that we used for screening purposes. It had some information kind of related to what we were doing in our testing of take-on transplant. And then kind of the key to that survey was we allowed people to opt in to being contacted by us at the University of Washington. So if participants opted into hearing about additional research opportunities related to the development or testing of take-on transplant, they would provide their name, their phone number, and their email address. And that information would come directly to us. And prior to prior to continuing with the screening survey, we had consent waived by or documentation of consent waived by our IRB at UW, and so that kind of allowed so that consent was not being done by collaborating sites externally. And then we also so if participants opted in, they also were able to opt out. So if they did not want to be contacted by us at University of Washington, they were not required to provide any sort of identifiers. We did provide compensation, a $10 gift card, and so if people wanted that compensation, then they would provide their email address, but that was not kept as part of the data set. Like I said, we kind of wanted a good kind of combination of those two options listed earlier for working with collaborating sites. And so we thought of creating this kind of additional layer of screenings using that screening survey. So we, again, were looking for that very specific population of community of concern. So again, people with Medicaid insurance, non-white race, Hispanic ethnicity, and high school education or less. We thought that since all the sites we were working with had registry current IRB approval, the registry allows for screening of Port CF to identify these eligible participants. And so we would ask these collaborators to screen Port CF and find those people. And we kind of piggybacked off of that current IRB approval, so we didn't need any additional IRB approval for screening. So fast forwarding to our results. So we just wrapped up enrollment, and we ended up advertising the screening survey and working with 15 other sites. We received a total of 92 individual responses, which ended up being an average of six per site. And of those 92 who responded, 60 people, or 65%, opted into being contacted about our pilot RCT, and of the people who were contacted, we had 36 people enroll. You'll see that there are, from this diagram, or the diagram from to the right, we had a number of people who were excluded. That was only because they were participants who had participated in earlier testing of our pilot RC of our development of take on transplant. So they had already had access to the website. We didn't want them to have access again, and so they were excluded because of that. And also, I think a handful were excluded because their FEV1 was higher than that 50% threshold, probably just because they were more, the information that they had in Port CF was probably a little old, potentially. And then here kind of shows all of our demographics for the people who participated. So we had 14 participants at the University of Washington, and then those 36 that came from collaborators for a total of 50. And in that blue box, you will see those are the people who were included from that community of concern, and we ended up having 62% of participants who were in that category, which was higher than our anticipated 50%, which was great. And then we do have some work to do. We would like to increase the enrollment of people in that Hispanic ethnicity so we do have plans to soon translate our website Take on Transplant into Spanish, so that we can start enrolling Spanish-speaking people and have them involved in our research. And if you are all interested in kind of our trial and what some of the results are, Dr. Ramos will be presenting that in a session that's, I think, right after this. So there's a plug for that. And then we also have a poster available. It's number 142. And then, so we have some conclusions and some takeaways. So we found that recruitment at these external sites was feasible using Port CF and local advertisement of the screening survey to eligible participants. And by enrolling at multiple sites, we were able to include a much more diverse population in our research. And then one note to consider before deploying this recruitment strategy, as we know, all IRBs are not created equal, and they all have their differences. And so I always recommend to talk to your regulatory contacts prior to doing this. We had, I believe, two sites had to get some level of approval from their IRB to help us out. But most people had no problem doing this with their IRB. And last but not least, with research and with many things in life, collaboration is key. And that brings me to my many thank yous to all the sites who helped us kind of along the way with developing the tool and with recruiting for our pilot RCT. Feel free to ask me for this return in favor. A lot of these people helped with just kind of the kindness out of their own hearts. We offered compensation, but not many people took that bait. And if you do see your name on this list, feel free to come up and say hi. A lot of this happened over Zoom and emails, and it'd be great to meet you in person. All right.
Thank you. So there's a couple questions. So when you were utilizing, Port CF, were you, or talking with your collaborators, were you targeting specific centers to try and get the broader Hispanic or non-white population, or is it just whoever would say yes?
So a little bit of both. We were working with a lot of collaborators that Dr. Ramos has collaborated with before, and so anyone who was willing to help us, we really tried to have this survey advertised at their site so we could have some of their participants. And we did have sites who helped us who were known to have kind of those populations.
Another question came in. Did your participating sites submit to their local IRB just to document their agreement with the non-engaged determination?
Yes. So I told every site to email their regulatory contact and tell them exactly what we're doing, and all of them did, and they got confirmation from their IRB that what we were doing was perfectly okay.
Yes, as one of the sites I can confirm. It actually worked really well. I was a little nervous going to our local IRB and having them
It took some explanation for sure. Mm-hmm.
But it ended up working.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Emma McWilliams. There we go.
That's weird. Sorry, technical difficulties.
Okay,
now it's
back.
Okay, so then you just have to click. Okay, yeah, I think I did that before. Good morning, everybody. I hope that you all have coffee. And bear with me if my voice is a little bit gravelly. My vocal cords are the last thing to wake up. Like this, so that I'm right up to the mic. There we go. Now I'm actually loud. y'all actually know I'm pretty loud. I have nothing to disclose. My name is Emma McWilliams. I am a clinical research coordinator at Boston Children's Hospital. I work really closely with the Success of Therapies Research Consortium. I've been working with the Study Management Corps for about 5 years, so many of you in this room may have gotten a lot of emails from me. And I'm really happy to put names to faces, so if any of you want to come up and say hi, definitely do so. So today I'm going to go over some kind of lessons learned from the Quest study, which has also been shouted out a couple of times during this conference. I worked a lot on the recruitment side for the Quest study and did all of the not all of the qualitative interviews, but I did a significant chunk of the qualitative interviews along with my friends from Johns Hopkins. The word left my head. So first off, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the Quest study and the processes involved with that. Oops, I clicked too far forward. So the Quest study was a sub-study of TD and Simplify study, and participants and caregivers in Simplify were given the opportunity to provide contact info for the Quest study at Simplify enrollment. And then participants and caregivers who provided contact info were contacted by staff from Boston Children's Hospital and Johns Hopkins University in order to discuss the Quest study. So we were essentially contacting people who had no idea who we were. Pretty much, they were just like, "Who are these people? Why are not why are they reaching out to us?" But they would be like, "Okay, this is somebody who's completely different from my person at my site. No idea who they are from Adam. Kind of pretty cold in that way." And to walk through how the study flowed a little bit, we had them complete the recruitment survey, and then we had folks who were selected for recruitment using purposeful sampling. We had about 119 folks who were selected for recruitment, and 109 of them ended up being eligible. We ended up consenting 69 adults and 23 teen parent dyads, which the teen parent dyads I'm particularly proud of because that is a really difficult one usually. We did have a handful of declines. We had about 5 who were just not interested. We had 5 who cited a lack of time, and then a few who just missed various consents and reach out calls. 7 of those who declined were teen and caregiver dyads, so they were a little bit more difficult to reach out to than the adults. And then we had pretty good completion for the study as well. We had 2 qualitative interviews that we did throughout the course of the study, one that was right after the end of Simplify participation and one that was about 4 months following that. And most folks completed interview 1, and then almost all completed interview 2. We had a couple of people who kind of dropped off during that time, but not too many for remote interviews, especially pretty long after the study that they originally signed up for. And this is just a look at what our sample characteristics looks like for that. We had a pretty even split all around. We had several people who were in the Dornase alpha arm of Simplify. We had several people who were in the hypertonic saline. We had a pretty even split between discontinue and maintain, and a pretty nice spread of ages. Obviously, once we got over 45, we had a little bit less, but still more than what I would have expected. About 27 years old was about our mean age, and for kids, again, same, pretty much evenly split. Oop, sorry, I'm too fast on this. So the study was conducted in this way. So we reached out, we got them consented and everything, and then the interviews were conducted via Zoom or using a recording device and study cell phone. I ended up conducting most of mine via Zoom, but there are some folks who did prefer to use just their cell phone, or they would be kind of on the go, or like they would be like, I just got here and my laptop's not charged, can we do the cell phone instead? So that was a pretty nice flexibility to have those options. We did, when we conducted Zoom interviews, have the interviewer and participants' cameras off to minimize privacy concerns. We didn't want their likeness to be part of what was captured. And all interviews were conducted in private, secure home office spaces, and all recordings were saved on secure drives before being uploaded to a compliant transcription service. And I do want to walk through a little bit of the pros and cons of Zoom because it made the study tremendously easier, obviously, because we were remote and reaching out to folks who were all over the place. But there are always some pros and cons with technology. So the pros with Zoom is that it's really easy to record, especially if you prefer to use a hands-free headset. I am, as you can see, somebody who talks with my hands. My preference is always to use a hand-free headset so that I can have my hands free to take notes or to do this. It's really easy to integrate into calendar invites. I would basically just schedule it, put their email in, and it would be in their inboxes really quickly, and they would be able to just put it into whatever calendar that they were using, importing it from there. And most participants are familiar with its use because folks have been working from home or doing school from home. So a lot of folks have been using Zoom over the last couple of years. I think that if we had gone back and done this in 2018, it might look a little bit different as to how comfortable people were with it. But post-COVID era, everybody was pretty comfortable with it. There were a couple cons with it. There can be some technical issues. There were a couple folks who I would get on Zoom and then we'd switch to the cell phone because they just were having a hard time getting their sound working or something like that. Participants can accidentally turn on their video. I did not have this issue as much because I would really upfront, I'd be like, keep your video off. I don't want the video to be on. But it is a possibility that they could accidentally turn their video on, and there were folks who, when we first got connected, would turn their video on, and I'd have to be like, no, we don't need that. Turn it off. Some participants were unfamiliar or uncomfortable with the software. I will say anecdotally, once we got to that older age group, especially folks who were not working, they were a little bit more uncomfortable with it, and I did most of those interviews via just phone and record. But that was a smaller percentage for sure. Some of the other things that I ran into was just bad internet on their end or mine, or system-wide outages of Zoom, or having a hard time running on patients' home devices. Sometimes people will open something up on their laptop and it will take a lot more resources than what they're anticipating. So my big takeaway, if you are using Zoom to do study conduct, is to just always have a backup plan. Because for me, it was very easy. I could just switch over right to the cell phone recording device and just go from there if anything happened. This is running off the page a little bit. It's okay, I can get it. So we did end up having, again, almost all consented participants complete interviews 1 and 2. 2 were either not in window yet or in the midst of attempted contact for interview 2 as of October 4th when I drafted this presentation. They have since been dropped because they just were unable to be contacted for their second interview. But our retention across this study was pretty good. So I was excited to see that. And we do have a couple of lessons learned from the Quest study. Just in general, I did find that participants in the lower lung function cohort or caregivers of younger patients did prove a little bit harder to reach. Often it was not impossible, but it did require multiple contacts and required a little bit more kind of attention to that person of okay, yep, I'm gonna reach out to them 3 or 4 times a week until I get an answer. One way or another, I would be like, if you say no, then I stop contacting you. That's how that works. So if I can get a hold of you and you say no, I can stop reaching out to you. I will say to try multiple methods of contact if you're having trouble reaching participants, especially remotely, obviously within the boundaries of your institutional rules. I know those vary across different sites. And giving a deadline for response from very hard to reach potential or current participants, we found would encourage a little bit more of a timely response. If I got to a point where somebody just was not answering texts, phone calls, any emails, anything, I would be like, hey, I need you to reach back out to me within X time frame because we're trying to do this. So if you were interested, reach out to me back within that time frame. And that ended up getting a couple of answers from some of the participants who were a little bit harder to reach. And I know that I think one thing that was very different, I think for a lot of people going into the pandemic, was that a lot of us were used to building rapport with our participants on site and having them see us and know who we were. For me, it was a little bit different because I've been working remote, not remotely, but I've been working in a way that was not always on site for a long time. So I think this is a special challenge, in the age of COVID specifically, with building rapport with participants remotely. And this is also running off the page. Just bear with me. is trying to get away. It's like, I want coffee this morning. If a participant has a specific method of communication they favor, I would say to utilize that first or more often. Especially when I was reaching out to parent-teen dyads, they often would prefer text. It was actually interesting. The parents would prefer text just as much as the kids would, which was interesting to me. Usually I find that adults tend to respond more to different methods of communication, but a lot of parents prefer the text. I would say to keep drafted samples of written communications like texts and emails, if that's something that you're able to do. It made it a little bit easier. I would have, like a generic text that I could put information into, and I was able to customize it really easily, and that just reduced my time reaching out to people, and made it easier for me to customize it for each person without drafting a multiple paragraph text message every time. And very important, maintain a detailed record of contact with all your participants, because when we're remote, it can often, it feels like we kind of can lose track a little bit easier, I think, than when we're in person. So you want to maintain a really detailed record of contact with all your participants, because that is going to provide you with insight into how many times you've reached out, or what things have come up, that kind of thing. I would even note this person prefers cell phone record over Zoom, so that I wouldn't try with Zoom if they weren't comfortable with it. And I would just say, and the last thing on that list that's running off the page is that to keep in mind that voice tone and things like that are a little bit more important, especially when you're communicating with people without video on Zoom. I would kind of add a little bit more emotion to my voice, and I would kind of make sure that it was really upbeat, and that way it was conveying, a feeling of rapport without the usual smile, nod, that kind of connection. And even when participants can't see you, I would say to use open body language, because it does change the way that you interact often. For me, if I open my arms and I'm kind of like this, then obviously that's changing the way that I'm interacting with folks, even if they can't see me. And obviously, last thing kind of on my little section of notes here is that special events are always important to indicate your engagement with that person as a life independent of CF. I found that they became more so without body language to fall back on. I had a couple of people get married, I had a couple job shifts. So me remembering those key points were kind of it seemed like that really meant a lot to them, especially when they couldn't see me and they were not as familiar with me from the get-go, all of that stuff. And I think the last thing I have is just a big thank you to everybody who was involved in this, to the various SCRC teams and the Simplify study team. Extra thank you to Dana, who was my co-interviewer for a lot of this, and all of the folks who have provided their leadership in this time. Yeah.
Oh, go right ahead.
Both of us. So that is a whole can of worms. A little bit, yeah. I only heard a little.
So he was asking, without having a video, so there was no video on either side, how does that affect the rapport for both you and the interviewee?
And I think also collection of qualitative information. Is that right?
The data. And then how does it affect the date? Yes.
Yeah. So that's a bucket of worms in qualitative work. It's do we look at people's facial expressions and all of that? I did not find that it affected rapport very much for me, because they already I already was introducing myself as somebody that they really didn't know often. They would be like, okay, this is a random person. They're not my RC at my site who's reaching out to me. So because I made my initial contact with them usually over the phone, I would usually give them a call and then a text message. They were kind of used to already communicating with me as this floating head that didn't really exist. So I did not find that really impacted it so much. As for the qualitative data piece, that's something that I think the qualitative experts out there can probably speak more to. But the end all with this study is that we did choose not to include that aspect in our collection and later analysis.
And then, so you mentioned, with the text messaging and
Yeah.
everything. Would you add anything additional to it? So in some of the conversations, we've kind of gone to, text, phone call, email.
Yeah.
What else? Because especially if you're doing these with folks
Yeah.
that you have not met from any of the participating Simplify sites.
Yeah.
It's a little variety.
So that was what we had approved, was text, phone call, email. I think that's how everybody communicates now. I honestly, most of my communication with my participants was via text message, and the majority of them preferred text message over any other method of reach out. I did have a couple of folks who often skewed a little bit older, and they wanted the phone call, but for the most part, they all wanted me to just send them a text, which makes sense.
So
I feel that
no
way.
Snapchatting?
I would not want to use Snapchat in the study myself, but I'm sure it could be an option.
Thank you, Emma.
No problem. Am I all set?
You're all set.
Well,
So next up, we have Lisa Bendy, who's going to talk on Hero 2. It's thinking. Always thinking. Well, it's slow like everything else this morning. We have a red arrow of death here. It's not the blue screen of death. It's not. Well, ooh. I probably just changed. you kind of did. Okay. You don't need slides, right?
I don't.
not so much.
Oh. Oh. Maybe.
Now is the time to go to the bathroom.
Get a refill on your water,
Get your water
stand up,
refill,
do a little stretch. If you didn't make the 6 a.m. yoga
Or a run.
or the run. Ooh.
Take a phone call.
Okay, so just that one.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to our session at closing out NACFC this year. It's been great to see everyone, be back in person, get hugs from Patty Burks. And so I'm going to present some information regarding our Hero 2 project and making real-world research successful. And just a note on everything, despite how the outcome of your project may be, we always learn something. So don't ever take anything as a complete fail. So that's just my little take on that. So I do not have any relationships to disclose. I am the research manager at Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis, and I do work with our lead PIs at our site for the TDN, and that's Stevie Sanders and Cynthia Brown on the adult side. So the Hero 2 project was home-reported outcomes in people with CF taking Trikafta. There was an original Hero project that was completed. I was brought on board late in the game for Hero 2 and its planning, but was there as the lead RC throughout the entire project. And these are the sites that collaborated on this project with us. So a little bit of background about why we want to look at real-world research and the Hero 2 project was ETI is obviously helping patients with CF correct that underlying defect. And so in this is going to raise the possibility of reducing the need for some types of chronic daily therapies. Kind of been the theme of this NACFC, just looking at de-escalation of different therapies that we may or may not do, whether that's the provider working with the patient or the patient-driven decision upon themselves. So real-world research data can complement the information that we learn from our different randomized clinical controlled trials. So the objective of HERO2 is to assess the impact that ETI therapy has on those changes in chronic CF treatment regimens. The specific aims were to determine the proportion of clinical features with patients with CF taking ETI who made changes to their chronic daily therapies and assess whether that relationship between those changes and the changes in their pulmonary outcomes were different. So looking at pulmonary function, lung data, pulmonary exacerbations, identifying different clinical features associated with stable pulmonary outcomes. So the design of the HERO2 study was a single-site IRB, which is a great thing, but also can be confusing. As we all know, our different sites have different requirements for our IRBs, and we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And for those of us that have that thought of we have to submit this to our IRB, in some institutions that still was the case, but for the most part it was a single site IRB held by Cindy Brown at Indiana University, and others did not have to submit or do anything extra with their IRB, just obviously being able to sign on or be a part of the project. It's a prospective observational cohort study. The participants had to track their symptoms and what their medication use over a 12-month period of time. Our goal was to enroll 860 individuals with CF that were taking ETI, and the different ways that patients were recruited were from social media initially, and a lot of push for that before we got sites up and running. The app that they interacted with and participated through was an app called Folia Health. There were actually already participants which were using that app and were already engaged with it. So once they saw there was something they could do to further interact with something with their care for CF, they could sign up for the project. And then we brought on referral and recruitment sites at a later time. Inclusion-exclusion criteria. The written informed consent process was done completely and entirely through the Folia app. We did not do any of that in person. There was also the ability, since participants had to be 12 and up, the participants also assented along with their guardian. They had to adhere to the protocol requirements. They had to have ETI and were taking that for an on-label indication, so they could not be participating in a current clinical trial. They had to be able to access the app either through their mobile phone, a tablet, or a computer system, and obviously they had to have internet connection for that. Exclusion criteria, they could not, if they did not have the necessary technology or the ability to access that, excuse me, and then they could not have had an organ transplant. They had to communicate in English, and if they were already in some portion of the randomized trial in Simplify, so that would not be allowed. So the different ways that recruitment and referral sites were set up was an interesting way just to try to get more engagement from our patients, but also engagement with our different coordinators and different sites that wanted to participate. At first, we brought on what were called referral sites. The referral sites' responsibilities were just to provide a recruitment flyer that had a QR code on it that was tied to their center. The patient was provided a flyer. It could be by a research coordinator, could be by their physician that was caring for them, could be provided by one of the clinical staff, whether it was the pharmacist, the clinical coordinator, any of those people that were in the clinic and with the patients that were potentially eligible. And then they provided that flyer, and then we're just told there's a potential study that you could participate in. They could take that flyer, they could scan that QR code, and they would be taken to the website that would tell them about not only the HERO2 study, but also how to sign up through the Folia app. There wasn't too much more required of the referral sites to answer questions, but they could. And they could also refer patients back to the contacts through either the study or through the Folia app. They did receive monthly reviews of participation or enrollment, and then just encouraging patients through the end of the study. But they did not have to make any kind of phone calls or anything like that. And then when recruitment sites were brought on, we had direct sharing about study information with the participants. They were asked to support the participants in potentially completing forms or if they had questions during the consent process after scanning their QR code. The enrollment data again was provided to the sites, and there was also a quarterly phone call that was made or attempted to be made to the participants just to make sure they were doing okay, didn't have any questions, weren't having any problems with the apps, or feeling like they were getting lost in the process. So the participants completed their informed consent and authorizations completely electronically through the Folia Health application. Great company that has provided support to the any participant that actually signs up for Folia Health, not just for this project. And their support staff could answer questions to participants if they could email and ask the people at Folia Health specifically if they were having concerns or problems, and they're very responsive and happy to help. So the data that was entered through the app, obviously they consented, then they had a baseline survey. They could do daily tracking through the app to say what kind of treatments or procedures they were doing for their care daily. There was an overall monthly review to look at how many times they interacted with the app and actually entered their daily therapy or daily tracking. And there was a goal that they needed to achieve, and they would be compensated for that. And then at the end of the study, when they completed, they were doing a questionnaire. The questionnaire was just asking, how did you feel about participating? What was the ease of using the app? Do you feel like this made a difference, in your tracking and knowledge of your own self-care throughout the time that you were in this study? And so our enrollment goal, we started in June of 2021, and you can see we had just the existing Folia users, and social media was the first target that this came out in. And then as we moved through the rest of the recruitment timeframe, we met our enrollment goal of 860 in August of 2022. And you can see how incredibly the graph moves up just once referral sites and recruiting sites were brought on board. So I feel like our outcome was successful. I think that a lot of that had to do with the upfront stuff that we did for planning and the design of the project. And once we got started, just making sure we had a lot of communication. We had weekly meetings that for the executive teams, just the planning team, so that we knew things that were going on, questions that would come in. But there was always communication. If I would get an email from either someone who had went to the Hero 2 site and they saw that I was the lead RC, clinical trial finder, any of those things, I would try to answer those questions as quickly as possible. And if I couldn't answer them, then I would go to Dr. Clement Brown or Dr. Clement Wren or Cindy Brown, and sorry about that, Clement. And just making sure if I didn't understand the question or if I needed more support or information to be able to appropriately answer that question, they were always there for me. And again, the team, Nell and Connie at Folia Health, were always available if there was something going on with the app. So just was ease of communication and being able to support people within a short time frame was very important, I think, to help in the success of this. So preparation and consideration of onboarding. So we wanted to make sure that when we were bringing on referral and recruitment sites that we were concise in what we were and the information we were sharing with them, and the ability for them to ask questions, feel like they knew what the steps were to take. If there was any hiccups with like any contract budget, IRB, any of those types of things, we had a phenomenal program manager coordinator, McKenna, who just really made the process a lot smoother and let things move through very quickly. And again, if any one of us on the team got a question that we felt felt that we couldn't answer, we always reached out to everyone on the team to be able to get those questions back. So we had a couple of education and training sessions with all the sites. Again, just to drive home, and even when we brought on recruiting sites, and that was another training, we did refresher for referral sites just to make sure that people were still engaged, still felt like things were going along well, and to be successful. And again, I reiterate the Central Research Administrative Coordination, most of that done by McKenna Flory. She was phenomenal and really helped keep the team on track and moving forward. So, and obviously engagement with our patients. We want our patients to feel like they can participate in things that sometimes, clinical trials come out, they're not eligible based on their mutations or other things that just limit them. And so just being able for someone to feel like they can participate and they make a difference in why we're doing all the things that we're doing. So future plans for the Hero 2, Dr. Wren did present some of the study data in his session yesterday, but obviously there's ongoing data analysis and comparison of what we've learned from this study. We're going to continue to support our teams and our participants until they are completed with the entire study, and obviously looking at the self-reported outcomes and clinical status comparisons. So I'd like to thank Dr. Brown, Dr. Wren. Kevin Soder is our statistician at Johns Hopkins, Kathy Sabadosa from CFF, Nell and Connie from Folia, and again, McKenna from IU. Eliza Fink and Lynn Doe were on the project when we started, and they have moved on to other positions. Our project team partners, Gunnar Esiason, Jackie Stroberg, and Laura Eddy, and obviously all of our patients with CF and their families. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a couple questions coming in. So you showed on your graph, you showed like how it's all broken down. Do you know how many different sites or where the patients came from? Because like our center was not participating, but I know we had at least a couple patients ask me about it, and I was like, we're not a site, but you can go. So do you know how it kind of breaks down?
Yeah, so actually, 90% of the participants that enrolled can actually, their information is linked back to their CF registry data. So we can actually know if they enrolled, what center they're coming from. So we can see that registry data on the backside de-identified. So that's kind of how we know that it's broken down. And as far as referral sites and recruitment sites, they would get a report, so they would know the number or the participants that were in the study. So I think on the backside, that's going to be data that will be shared at a later point. Good question.
So with so many support staff involved in the project, from the study team to Folia to everyone else, was there some way to harmonize all of that information if a subject were to ask multiple people the same question, make sure that you were all on the same page and providing the same answers?
Yeah, so usually if something came in, the question then went, depending on what the question was centered around, it went back to the team. So it would be the smaller group of us that were actually the study team. And so, like I said, we had weekly meetings, but it was always, if it was something in an email and it was regarding payment or something with the app, then I would send that email on to Connie. But we did make sure that that information was clear, that if you're having a concern or a problem with the app, contact Connie at Folia Health, and Connie was usually right on it. So, but she would also share that back. Hey, I got a question about. So in our weekly meetings, those types of things were covered, just to know that these were the types of things that were being asked, or this is what, But if it was something one of us didn't feel quite 100% on, obviously we shared that with the team to make sure we were giving the best feedback. So.
Nice. And then there's one on the app. So, never mind. You just read it really fast. That was really good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Dana's up next.
This one, I want to make sure I'm giving you the right one.
Okay, we have the red arrow again, so we'll just take a minute. Oh, God, look at you go. Is everyone waking up? This is, take a little nap. This is like all the technology. Yeah. One thing that I keep saying in a lot of my remote research is that research coordinators are not IT. So please remember that in all of your remote research also. Sounds like Lisa had a really good IT support on her side from the Folio folks, so. Yes?
There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
So then you just start there, and then you can use the buttons if you need to.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dana Yablon. I'm a senior research. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm a senior research program coordinator at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and today I'm going to be talking about remote device monitoring. There are no relationships to disclose related to this presentation. So this is just a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. The purpose of remote device monitoring, obtaining devices, participant training, data collection, and troubleshooting. So many research studies, as we know, are moving in the direction of telehealth, which means that we are now able to capture participant data outside of clinic. The term devices can mean anything from nebulizers, spirometry tests, to Fitbits. At Johns Hopkins, we have used devices for remote monitoring among several research studies, but I will be speaking on my experiences with nebulizers and Fitbits. However, I believe that everything listed in this presentation can be applied to any device. All right, choosing the right study for your device. Choosing the right device for your study. So there are a lot of factors that determine the capability of the device. Factors that we need to think about are how the data is being captured, the usability of the equipment, and the participant's comprehension of how the device works. When you receive the device at your site, you'll want to do standardized testing. This is essential before sending it out to participants. And honestly, this is a really fun part of being a research coordinator. Put yourself in the participant's shoes. So if you have a Fitbit, you might accidentally leave it in your car overnight if you're taking it off to go do something. So leave that equipment, leave that device in a hot car overnight. Or if it says you can get it wet, throw some water on it or drop it a few times. Leave it around a pet, just get fun with it. Really just put yourself in the participant's shoes. But you also want to think through the technology that is needed to make sure that the device works properly. So do we need good Wi-Fi? Does the participant need a smartphone? Can this participant's smartphone even download the app? Do they have accessible outlets in their home to plug in the Bluetooth device? These are just all things that you really need to think through. And lastly, it's important to order a small sample size close to study launch. We had a situation where we ordered devices several years before a study was launched, and unfortunately, they all expired. So we were able to work with the manufacturer to reboot the device to capture the correct data, but this was definitely a hiccup and something that moving forward we will only order within a few months of study launch. Which also brings me to my last point, make sure that you have the right budget. So if you are thinking about launching a study and it doesn't launch within that year, the price of the device might change. So you want to make sure that you have that budget available. So as I mentioned earlier, sites can take 1 to several years to launch a study. So during that time, you might have new research coordinators, new staff coming through your study team. That's why it's essential to have a master inventory log of where all the devices are located, what shipping service you use, and date of shipment of those devices. Everything listed in the master log can help with organization, consistency, and accountability between the research staff, the participants, and the mail carrier service. Here's an example of what our inventory looks like. So we, at Johns Hopkins, we use Excel for our inventory log, but we also use a database. This is an example of what it looks like in our inventory log on our Excel spreadsheet. It's more of an overarching theme. So we have the serial number, the date the devices were received at GHU, the designation, so who it was going to, and then where it was, so if it was in the field or if it's present at our site. But this is an example of what it looks like in our database. So as you can see, it's more detail oriented. We have the specific device number, we have QC details, what generation of that device it was. This is another example of what our inventory log looks like in our database. So in the far right-hand corner, you have the return status, the return date, and then the date of deactivation and any post-quality control that was needed. So once you've received the device, it's time to contact the participants to ship it out. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about hard-to-reach protocol, as my colleague Andrea Goodman will go into that later. But I will say you will want multiple points of contact, so preferably 2 phone numbers, email addresses, home addresses, and the site RC's email information. Because, as we know, the participants are more familiar with the site RC than the lead RC on that study. I always contact the caregiver first. As we know, teenagers are not great at responding. We've had situations where I've tried to contact a child and I found out that they were grounded and their parent took away their cell phone. So that has happened more than once. So always contact the caregiver first, and usually they'll be the ones to respond. And you'll want to document all of your contact efforts. That is for accountability. Here's an example of what our record of contact looks like in our database. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we have, why we were contacting the participant, the date of contact, time, our method of contact. As you can see, we have 4 different options. Sometimes it can be more, the outcome, and a description of the encounter. And then on the right-hand side, we have all the instances of when we were contacting them. So once you are able to get in contact with the participant and you've confirmed their address, it is time to ship out the device. So we have all probably shipped a package or received a package at some point in our life, and these are all the issues that tend to arise within our personal lives, and it's no different for a participant. So hence why we need an inventory log, so we know who the mail carrier service was, where the tracking number was. So if a package was lost, we're able to track it down, or if there's going to be a delayed delivery, we know to contact the participant. Once they've received the device, you can go ahead and send them an email script with an introduction of what the training is going to look like. Along with that, you'll send an introduction sheet and or training video that your site can come up with. And then this instruction sheet and training video is good for them to review before you do the video call training and after if they have any questions. Once you're on the video call, you'll want to show them how to use the equipment, and this is a great time to build rapport. Building rapport is essential. It helps the participant understand why they're in the study, the purpose of the study. If you need to contact them later, they will be more familiar with who you are and not screen your calls. And also, if they're more likely to take care of the device and return it if that is something that they need to do at the end of the study. So this is an example of one of our instruction sheets that we use for one of our studies. So starting on the left-hand side, we tell them exactly what they're going to receive in the mail. For this study, they needed a Fitbit and they needed to connect it to an app because their Fitbit data would sync to the app, and that's how we collect data for the study. So we show them a screenshot of what the app would look like, how to log into that, and then because syncing is one of the most important steps, we would need to show them step by step how to sync their Fitbit data. And then we gave some helpful tips and tricks at the bottom. And then on the far right, you can see that we show them how they can read their own data. So if they need to read their heart rate or can't see how many steps they're taking, we have that information available to them at use. And it's not shown here, but we also add in our contact information so that they can easily refer back to this and say, oh, Dana from Johns Hopkins, this is her contact information. Let me reach out to her real quick. And this is just a screenshot from one of our training videos. We have it accessible on YouTube. There's a 3-part series that really breaks down each part of the equipment. And the participants can refer back to this. I will like to note that training videos are great for participants, but RC should have a more comprehensive training to go along with the equipment. So it is essential to monitor the data throughout the study, not just at the end. So we advise the study team to involve the PI and the entire study team early on. This will help with identifying errors or things that you might have not known would be an issue. So to do this, the RC or the data analyst, whoever is looking at that data every week, will need to do a weekly quality control. So just checking that dashboard that houses the data, make sure there's nothing that looks wonky, and then also sending out monthly surveys to the participants to see if they are having any issues. This is great for a larger multi-site study because it's with a smaller study, you're able to know each participant individually. You can reach out to them, you know them personally, but when you have 100 people in a study, you just need a questionnaire to see if everybody's doing okay. And then frequently you'll want to bring all that data to your entire study team and get everyone involved in looking at that data so everyone can see it with a fresh pair of eyes and bring any awareness to issues that might happen. So here's an example of our 3-question monthly survey that goes out to participants. So the first question, we'd ask them if they're even using the device, and they can mark yes or no. And the second question, we ask them if it's been working properly. This is a really good time for participants to come forward and say that they need new equipment. But sometimes they don't know what they need. So that's why we have the third question of, would you like a study team member to reach out? So with this person, they didn't know they needed new equipment, but they knew something was wrong with their device. So they said yes, they would like a study team member to reach out to them. And I was able to reach out to them and identify that they needed new equipment. This is also an example of what our 3-question monthly survey can look like if a participant says they stopped using their device. So they have the option to put in those dates. And then as you can see at the very bottom, it asks the study team if that data that the participant reported was accurate to the data that we received on our dashboard. And we are able to mark yes or no. This is very helpful for data cleaning purposes later on. And lastly, troubleshooting. So as an RC, you might think, I don't know anything about devices, or I'm just here to ship it out and look at the data. But no, you are going to be that participant's point of contact. They are not going to reach out to the manufacturer. Even if they were, the manufacturer of the device could take several weeks to respond to them. As an RC, you can get back to them within 24 hours, or at least say, hey, let me look into that, and just give them some sense of rapport and accountability on your end. Of course, you'll want to have a good relationship with the manufacturer so that if there are bigger issues, you can reach out to them for guidance. Here are some common reported problems that we've seen. So with participants, you'd be surprised by what they have issues with. I had a participant say, I stopped using the device because I didn't know how to charge it, when there's batteries and a charger that comes in their package. Or we'll have people say, I didn't know how to turn it on. So of course, you want to refer back to that instruction sheet and, be detailed with your training, but you'll also want to know how to fix those problems. And those problems seem easy, but there are more complex issues that come up that you'll want to know. So for our nebulizer, here are some common reported problems that you see here. So something simple, the device does not stop automatically after medication is consumed, and the possible solution would just to clean the aerosol head, but then there are some more complex issues like the handset is leaking, and as you can see, there's a solution to that. And that is it. Thank you so much.
So, my question for you. So, I've said that, RCs are not ID. Mm-hmm. So, how many of, when there's like an issue, how many of the RCs are like, okay, great, with this subject, and then it just gets shoveled to you? So, do you have that a lot?
As an RC, we make sure that everyone, so at all sites, if they are working with devices, are trained on how to use the device. But it's always good to have one main person who is an expert, who's an RC and not the manufacturer, so that you have somebody that will quickly respond to your issues.
And then, trying to find these devices because you're shipping them potentially anywhere. How are you had to kind of deal with collecting them and then what?
Yes, so for the study that we're referring to with getting devices returned, some of those participants have been in the study for a year. And some of them have maybe stopped using the device, or they don't need to be, they don't have as frequent check-ins. So if that's the case, it can get a little bit harder to get in contact with them. So at that point, you'll want to bring in the entire study team to get a hold of them. That could be the RC from the participating site who might have a stronger connection to them. Or if there's a therapist who is working with them in the intervention, you can bring in the therapist or even a physician. Just bring in the entire team to get this device back. Of course, you might not be able to, but that, using multiple points of contact is really essential.
Thank you, Emma.
All right, thank you.
And then our last speaker today is Andrea Goodman, and she's gonna bring it home, tell you about the hard to reach protocol that Dana just referred to, and what to do with all this data that they've collected remotely, assuming this one works. Well, don't clap yet. We still have to open this presentation.
Need some music playing.
I know. Yeah, we know that. Okay.
It'll happen.
Hopefully. You've done this before.
You can talk on. I was just saying yesterday how I hope this didn't happen to me.
The very end, I know it did happen in one of the sessions where there were no slides and the presenter just TED talked it.
A lot of pressure.
You can bring it home. Technology. Where are you walking to? There we go.
Okay, so what do I do?
So it's just, you have to do this to at least get it going, and then you can use your buttons if you want, but you can just keep it there too. Good. Okay,
All
everybody.
right.
It just takes a little while.
I think I can do it now. Yay! So my name is Andrea Goodman, and I'm a Senior Research Program Manager at the Johns Hopkins University. I work with the Success with Therapies Research Consortium and serve in the data management core there at Johns Hopkins. And so today I'm going to talk to you about some strategies to use for remote data collection, specifically to help with retention. I will say that the strategies I'm going to talk to you about are really geared towards behavior-based or interventions or observational studies and ones that are longitudinal. They're not really ideal for maybe a drug trial with a smaller N. I have no disclosures for today's presentation. So once a participant is recruited, and we do a lot of work to get them engaged and enrolled in our study, we have to do as much work to keep them in the study. And ensuring that we can keep them in the study can help with making sure that poor retention may lead to a reduction of power, potential biases, or missing data can also affect our conclusions. So retention is dependent on many different components, such as study design, study planning, making sure you have staffing and compensation, communication, we've talked about already, having good building rapport, making sure we also do proper informed consenting so participants are aware of what they're enrolling into and that they are knowing also what is coming after the next step. And today I want to talk to you more about how you can utilize standardized processes such as the hard to reach protocol and study windows to help with retention, as well as study reports and how you can monitor your milestones and data quality, and that can also help to utilize and help with your retention numbers. So first I'm going to talk to you about the hard to reach protocol. The main thing that you're going to see in the hard to reach protocol is having some variation. So varying the times of day of which you're contacting them, so before 11, in the afternoon around 3, after 6, when they're home from work and school and activities, as well as making weekend contacts. Additionally, you want to vary the methods of which you're contacting them. So using calls, texts, emails, and surprisingly, letters still work. So think about yourself and your own schedule. And if you're engaged in a research activity, or even if somebody's just trying to contact you for, I don't know, a PTA meeting or scheduling your own clinical care visits, when's the best time for you to be reached? For me, I'm going to tell you that you need to call me on Wednesdays at after 6:30 because I have to sit at my daughter's gymnastics for an hour and a half, and it's a great time for me to get caught up. So again, you're going to think about that with your own study participants. If you're always calling Tuesdays at 4 o'clock and that's when they have a standing business meeting or an after-school activity, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to reach that study participant. So varying the times and the methods of which you're contacting is really important. But additionally, you need to tap into other resources, such as you're contacting your clinical care team or checking medical records to see what's going on in that participant's life, if there's additional records of information that can be tapped into. This protocol has been used in varying different studies in over a decade. You've heard Dana talk about it during her presentation. Emma used it in the qualitative quest study. And we also have another investigator there at Johns Hopkins University who has created some additional resources that the link is there for you guys to review that can help with longitudinal studies with follow-up of patients. I want to add that this is just an example of kind of what our hard to reach protocol looks like. It can be adapted. I want to add that of the decade of being used, we've had no complaints of the use of the study. what has been one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had is when a teenager who lived with both mother and father, who had lots of busy activities. They were involved in after-school activities and 4-H, and they are part of like the honor society. They just had a lot on their plate. Plus, they were managing a chronic illness. When I pursued them, they said, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I thank you for continuing to contact me," because that's what this really is. This is just us continuously extending an opportunity for study participants to engage. And specifically in longitudinal studies or behavioral-based studies, we want to be sure that we're engaging with everybody. Another really rewarding experience is when we've had a clinician come up to us and say, "I cannot believe you got Sally enrolled in that study," right? "I can't believe that you've also retained them in the study," because that historically hasn't happened, and we've honestly haven't approached them again for a while because they always tell us no. So who is typically like the hard to reach person, right? So we know teenagers, you've heard it multiple times today, they are hard to reach, but also young adults. They're in a transitional period of their life. They're also kind of fall into that category, as well as those that are very sick or often miss appointments, and when you're conducting longitudinal-based studies. The ABC study is an example of a study that has implemented the hard to reach protocol. I will mention that this study is very different recruitment population than maybe our CF. We are recruiting from a low-income population, young parents often with unstable housing, and also unreliable phones. We are recruiting from the Baltimore City Head Start program, and we had to screen nearly 10,000 children just to enroll 400. But during the second year of the process of this study, the team was really concerned that there was a high percentage of patients who were unable to contact. And so we wanted to implement the hard to reach protocol and do some pre-post comparisons to see, did it work? And you'll see that in year 2, we have resulted in a higher percent of consented as well as a lower percentage of those who were unable to contact. It also led into retention numbers, which our intervention retention numbers were higher once we were implementing the hard to reach protocol. So jumping into study windows now and how you can utilize them for retention and the importance of those study windows. Sorry. So study windows help study staff manage their workload. If you know what a window is and when it's coming into window, you're able to better manage when you need to contact somebody, what days you have to contact them, and how you put this recruitment or that retention processes also in with all the other responsibilities that we are managing. It helps to identify which participants to prioritize. So if a window is 6 weeks and we have a participant we're still trying to reach and they're nearing 5 weeks, it helps us to say, hey, we need to put a little extra attention on this participant because their window is going to close. It helps determine staff to determine when to start pursuing them. A window may open to say that, hey, you can now start contacting them. And it also helps to establish when a assessment can first be completed. So the first day assessments can be completed, as well as establishing the last day assessment can be completed. And anything outside of those windows then would be considered a protocol deviation. So the CF Wellness study is an example of using clear standardized processes such as study windows and a harder reach protocol. It's a multi-site study with adults with CF experiencing non-respiratory symptoms. Surveys are sent to study participants quarterly via email. They are sent 1 day prior to the due date, and then we have automated reminders from our REDCap database that are sent on day 2, 4, and 6 after that first initial message, if they're not completed. And then RCs also follow that harder reach protocol if the survey is not completed after day 8, and the window for this study is 6 weeks. So we are looking at retention rate for this study, and it's a longitudinal study, so every 3 months for a year, and we wanted to see what retention is looking like, and you can see by the data there, we have very high retention rates, even going all the way out to 12 months. But we also wanted to look at, great, retention rates are high, we have these standardized processes, what's working, what's not working, and so we wanted to see how long is it taking participants to actually complete these surveys remotely. And so with a mean of 5 or less, the vast majority of people aren't needing human contact to get all the surveys done. But it also shows that the percent of participants that still need some sort of human contact following the hard to reach protocol because they're not completing it by day 8. So example, at baseline, we have 15% of the population that still needed that hard to reach protocol. I believe Dana mentioned how we utilize record of contacts within our studies, and we do that in our database and REDCap. And so later we could even go back even further to see how many contacts are being needed to get the completion data. So individuals who need that little extra help to complete the assessment need to be considered when you're developing all your standardized processes. Additionally, I want to talk to you about study reports. Study reports can assess for milestone achievement, discrepancies in data, workload, and identifying sites. And I'm going to break it down, hopefully, if my stuff all works, in the follow-up slides. So we look at our reports weekly as a whole study team, and we look at things like milestone achievement. How closely are we to reaching our goal? What is our goal for this month? What is our goal for this week? What is our goal overall? What do we need to do this week in order to meet that goal? Typically, we're looking at completion numbers, but that might also be our goal is to, limit the number of people who are unable to contact or something of that sort. We also use study reports to help identify discrepancies. So if numbers within a report don't line up, this could be a result of data entry error. RCs are typically the best to identify, like, oh yeah, that doesn't match because I'm pursuing that person and I just started pursuing them and I forgot to go into REDCap and mark pursuing, and it still looks like they're out of window or not in window. So it's really a conversational tool during your weekly reports to talk about data and how things are looking. Let's see. Next, I just want to use how we use different categories such as pursuing or how we use our study reports to identify workload. We can often use pursuing to identify if we have the appropriate staffing and allocation of staff to meet all those that are within window to be pursued. We might also determine if we need to bring other individuals in. If we see that there's a high number of people who are out of window or unable to contact, we want to have conversations again about workload and staffing and if we need to do further reallocation, or if we also need to have training. The next slide kind of just breaks down how we define these different categories. So pursuing is when a window is open and the study team is contacting and pursuing that study participant. Whereas out of window is the data has been closed for data collection, and unable to contact means we've been doing everything we can to reach that study participant, but they can no longer be contacted. We're only leaving them messages and they're not being reciprocated. With a study withdrawal is when the participant initiates the full discontinuation of the study, whereas a declined assessment means the participant initiated, unable to complete, but would like to remain in the study. Lastly, I want to talk to you about systematic reviews. Research coordinators are best suited to develop systematic ways to increase efficiencies in future studies. 2 ways of doing that is a quality improvement project or a study within a trial. We often hear about QI projects, so I'm not going to spend time today talking about that. But a study within a trial is when a research study is embedded within the trial with aim of evaluating and exploring alternative ways of developing or organizing specific trial processes. The ABC study is an example of a retrospective SWOT. Additionally, for the CF Wellness study, could also go back and do a retrospective SWOT. Then conclusion. Standardized processes such as a hard-to-reach protocol, clear study windows can help strengthen your retention. When developing these procedures, you need to be specific to your study population, including those who normally do not participate, and do appropriate problem solving. And reports can assist in monitoring study progress, staffing allocation, data entry error, and site performance. And then please consider testing standardized processes using a QI or SWOT approach to find how you can improve your own recruitment and retention processes. And lastly, I just want to say a big thank you. It takes a village. And I thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning.
So, I've done the hard to reach protocol.
You have done the hard to reach protocol.
And my question, I mean, I know my experience, but throughout when you've done other studies with it, where do you find that balance? What's the best way to say, especially in a remote study where you don't necessarily have a lot of contact with that subject, where do you find that balance of how hard am I going to pursue this one person for the study versus throw a wider net and try and get someone else who maybe will respond?
That's a great question. And honestly, that's kind of what the hard reach protocol does, because once you've tapped out of that, you know that now your efforts need to go somewhere else, right? But there is some fluidity, especially when we talk about our study windows, right? So if you have a large pool of participants who are within study window and they're quote unquote easier to get to, you can prioritize a little bit, right? But the hard to reach protocol is there so that you know when to tap out, to say, I've done what I can. It is challenging. I've done it for over a decade. But I will say, when I think of it and when I change my mindset to this is an opportunity that I'm presenting to our study participants, just like we do with all the efforts we do with recruitment, it does make a difference. Additionally, you have to also consider that it's really helpful in diversifying your sample.
Similar question, but for the RCs who might be implementing it, I mean, it's a pretty aggressive approach. Obviously it works, but do they take comfort that there's a protocol to follow and they're like, it's not me harassing this person, or are they uncomfortable with calling them so? Like, how do you find the RC attitude?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we've had a mixed bag. We definitely had research coordinators who come to us from other types of studies who aren't used to that kind of approach. I will say that, again, this is really helpful for longitudinal, behavior-based, working with those that are typically hard to reach, right? It's probably not ideal for when you can cherry pick a sample size. I think a lot of the mentality of like, does this work, does this not work, or can I do this or not do this, or is this too invasive, goes to also how it's being trained, the purpose and the why behind utilizing it, understanding how you can diversify your sample, and that those participants that need the harder reach, they need the harder reach. And so in order to be inclusive, we have to do a little bit extra work for those patients.
Exactly, especially with the new trials that are coming through on both sides. You know, we're going to have to be able to reach out to those that have not been participating in trials or have been omitted from a lot of research. So this is good.
Yeah, and I will say, like, so you saw in the hard to reach protocol, hopefully you remember, it said, like, you know, make calls before 11 a.m. Have there been times where I've had a study participant that called and said, I work the night shift. If you call me before like X time, I will not answer and I will be upset. And that's respectful. Respect that. If a participant is clearly disclosing to you that they cannot be contacted during a certain time, respect that. But this is for those participants that aren't as upfront with their availability and how you have to use different methodology and variations to get them into or engage them continuously through the study.
And then someone in the audience just asked, do you need to use your hard to reach protocol? Do you get IRB approval for it, or is it embedded into your general study protocol?
Correct. So we don't upload like a hard to reach protocol within our application, but if you're familiar with IRB processes, you know you have to explain kind of your recruitment and your retention practices. And so we do put a language into that, just indicating that we make varying calls at varying times of day, methods, and all those things. Additionally, we have a lot of data to support the utilization of it, specifically for certain populations that we can always give to our IRBs to help support the protocol.
Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you, guys.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming today. The speakers are still up front if you have any questions and you want to talk to them personally, and you get 5 minutes back in your morning. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.